Hello, I'm reading for the Yiddish Book Center's Translators Aloud series. My name is Rachel Mines, and I was a Yiddish Book Center Translation Fellow in 2016. My fellowship project was a collection of short stories by Jonah Rosenfeld, which was published by Syracuse University Press in the spring of 2020, and I'm going to be reading from one of the stories in the book. Jonah Rosenfeld was born in the town of Translators, now in Ukraine, in 1882. He emigrated to the U.S. in 1921, where he became a major literary contributor to the Yiddish Forverts, where he was known as a writer who explored human psychology. He died in New York in 1944. I'll be reading from his story, Mazel Tov. Azoi gleich wie der Doktor hat abgetan sein doktorske Sach mit'n Weibel, und die Sach, was hat abgetan, is rüber bescholem, hat angeklungen zu Mann von einem Weibel und ihm abgegeben. Mazel Tov. The business with the young wife had gone well, and the so-called doctor phoned her husband as soon as he'd finished. Mazel Tov, he said to the husband. He smirked into the receiver, pleased with his clever little joke, congratulating the man who'd brought in his wife so he could do what he'd done to her. The three of them, who'd met just yesterday, had hit it off right from the start, as it usually happens when a couple comes to a doctor with a third thing between them, a thing that belongs to them both and that they've both agreed to dispose of. The doctor, after examining the wife, gave her a little pat on the belly. A-OK, he said. They argued a little. The doctor said she was in her 5th month, but the wife said it was her 4th. Actually, the doctor had no idea how old the fetus was, but he had to say 5, so he could explain that getting rid of a 5-month-old fetus is very difficult, and he'd have to charge more. That morning, before work, the husband had driven his wife to the doctor and left her there. Now the husband and the doctor were talking things over on the phone. They spoke in code, of course. No one listening would ever imagine they were discussing a human being that one of them had put into a woman's womb and the other had ripped out. The wife, in the next room, could hear what the doctor was saying. She knew he was talking to her husband, and she was feeling a bit upset with them both. At first she'd wanted to get rid of it as much as her husband had, but now resentment and humiliation were setting in. She was starting to suspect that she hadn't actually had to go through with it. What if she'd carried to term and had the baby, she thought? Would she be lying in a strange bed in a stranger's house all by herself without her husband and family there? Would her husband have abandoned her if she'd just had a baby? Was she in any less pain now than if she'd carried to term and the baby had been born alive? At first, the rationale was that she'd had no choice. What else could she have done? It was only 5 months after the wedding, and she'd had no experience of life. She'd been a sensible, respectable young girl who'd lived a sensible, respectable life before her wedding, not for her own sake, but because of the man who'd come along and expect her to be that way. A man like that would want to live it up, fool around a bit after they were married, just the two of them, man and wife. But a baby would hold them back. They'd be trapped. Her husband had wanted to enjoy himself before settling down once and for all. He'd wanted to let himself go with his new bride before she got pregnant, because then it would all be over. The doctor hung up the phone, returned to the wife, and asked how she was doing. Now that the doctor was right there in front of her, and remembering what she'd let him do to her, the young wife felt vaguely embarrassed, and somewhere deep inside was a gnawing regret. In a muddled sort of way, she was thinking about that something he'd torn out of her. She wanted to know what it had looked like, and what sex it had been, if it had been anything at all. She had the foggy notion that they'd taken from her a silent, shapeless, inanimate being, something that had begun in deathly stillness and would grow into life. But they hadn't let it live, so it went from one kind of death to another and died without ever having lived. From a death that should have become a life, it went directly to a second death, instantly spanning a lifetime of years and a whole world full of people, and from nothing it became nothing. It shouldn't have bothered her, but it did.